Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Russell Gay, Associate Professor of Management and David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics. Welcome to the Faculty and Staff Ethics Interview Series. Today's guest is Paul Kinghorn. Paul is the Director of the Center for Business Growth and Innovation and Advance Iowa. He's also the Intellectual Property Officer at UNI for the past 7.5 years or so. Been heavily involved now and in the past in consulting and other leadership services for companies like Astonic Management Group, Ohio University, and Apex Consulting. His MBA is from Ohio University. His undergrad was in finance from Franklin University, also in Ohio. And we're going to talk today about some of the various ethical dilemmas he's faced throughout his career, whether it's the academic world, consulting, practice, whatever the case may be. So Paul, thank you and welcome to our show.
Well, glad to be here and share my experiences.
Absolutely. I think the students will get a lot out of this, faculty members, colleagues in the community, whoever the case may be watching us. So where do you want to start? I know from your background, you've got a lot of different expertise there. So obviously we'll focus on ethics, but I'll kind of let you steer this ship the direction you want it to go and choose what area you want to start in first.
Sure. Well, as I was sharing with you earlier, something that kind of got me thinking about ethics from the first perspective. Years ago when I was in college, I was also a teaching assistant in an accounting program. And I remember that part of the assignment was to introduce the concept of ethics to the group. And we would share these studies or examples and then talk about them. And I was struck in that setting. It's very static, neutral environment. That we'd share this and to a person, every single person. Of course, I would do the right thing. What would you do under these circumstances? And then we tried to, but what if, and again, everybody held true to the, I would never deviate from it. I would do the right thing, and which is admirable on the surface, except I think unrealistic in reality, because when you get all the other dilemmas that come into play, it gets a little bit dicier. And at that time, I actually was working a job at this university. So it's a private university. It was a religious affiliation. And I was working in their waste treatment center. And without getting into a lot of detail about the waste treatment center, the truth of the matter is it goes into this process where the effluent of the waste is processed. And then once it's been cooked, for lack of more formal description, it's run off into these leach beds, and then it's then cleaned up and taken to a dump. That's the way the process should be. But because the cost of and the time it takes to leach it off and dispose of it was a lot, the individual who was running this particular facility decided that it was better to divert the effluent from and fertilize, as it were, a section of a hill. And it just so happened that they were growing bananas on this hill, and you could see the road from the shoreline looking up. You could see the road cut between this banana field, and what was to the right of the road, which was just below where this effluent plant was stationed, was very lush and green. And what was to the left of it was not nearly as lush and green, for all the obvious reasons, right? So here I am, in this situation at a school of a religion that I'm affiliated with, and faced with, what would you do and what should you do?
Absolutely.
And I have to admit, I opted not to do anything. I didn't route it out. I didn't talk about it. I didn't, disclose it. And I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, because looking back, it probably wasn't. But the consequences, whose problem? Is it really my problem? Is it somebody? I mean, I'm not the only one looking up at the hill. Could have seen two very different colored banana plantations. So I shared a little bit of that experience with this group, and I know that it really swayed them one way or the other. But suffice it to say, ethics is never a nice, clean, easy, especially when you find yourself forced or thrown into the middle of a situation that wasn't of your own making.
Yeah. And that's why we often use the word dilemmas when we're talking about ethics, because none of the choices are normally going to be ideal. In a perfect world, we can normally see the good in both directions, the bad in both directions. We're kind of caught in the middle somewhere, and that's what makes it difficult. And yeah, you brought up the accounting TA thing, and I teach leadership every semester, and I'll have them kind of self-assess themselves on various ethical situations and ethical maturity scales and things like that. And like you said, it's always, well, I haven't been in this position before. This is what I think I would do. And yeah, there's that word of caution. Try to back that up in the real world if you're ever faced with this situation. But it's very difficult what you think you would do on paper reading a scenario versus what actually happens in the real world.
When it becomes real to you, right?
Yeah,
So your
absolutely.
reputation's on the line, or your livelihood, right? The
Mhm.
job that you have, or in some cases, the consequences if you choose wrong.
Exactly.
Now all of a sudden you begin to own the problem, and while it might not have been yours initially because of what you did or didn't do, now you start to have an obligation, and in some cases,
Right.
the legal side of it can become
Yeah,
a sticky
absolutely.
wicket. So.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's certain things that we make the argument in the leadership class that this might not be illegal, even though it's unethical, or even though it's unethical. But yeah, there's some crossover on those areas. Certain things might be fine from the legal system, but still frowned upon, and vice versa. So there's many things to consider.
Well, let me share an experience, if you will, that kind of
Absolutely.
gets kind of mucky that I had in my personal career. So I was doing consulting work, kind of as an executive for hire, and I happened to work with one manufacturing firm who had gone through a roller coaster of some ups and downs, and they were trying one last gasp attempt to right the ship and get it going. And they identified me as somebody who could help them. So I was hired on as their vice president of sales and marketing.
Okay.
Happy to step into that role and help the company out. Now, to set the stage a little bit, they had procured $500,000 in financing from the state of Ohio, low interest loan, through an economic development program they had.
Okay.
And they had also followed that up with another $500,000 from a local bank. So $10 million on the line for this company. And it had been around prior to, at least in the form of this existing entity, for about 7-8 years.
Okay.
The history of the company went back, 100 years, 125 years, I think. It was in the window manufacturing industry. So anyway, been around a while, and in a very small community, so a major employer in that community at one point. And while that wasn't the case when we were there, it still was a large footprint, buildings, and important to the community, hence why the state was wanting to put money into it.
Okay.
Anyway, so here I am in this role, and we're finding out that because of some of the actions and things that had happened before operationally, it was a difficult slog to try and energize the sales channels and get people on board. Not impossible, but we're having to build that up.
Yeah.
The gentleman who owned the company, also was the president, was very charismatic and could sell. This guy was really, really pretty powerful in
Okay.
that. And we determined that it probably would be best for both of our skill sets and the good of the organization if we flipped roles, right? He still owned it, but he would take the role of sales and marketing VP, and I would become the CEO of the company, or the president, and have it go. So we're still internally doing this role transition as we're trying to prepare for the future. Had not yet gone to the board
Okay.
and gotten the board approval. So that's important to the story.
Yeah, I bet.
Because they hadn't signed off. I wasn't an official fiduciary officer in that capacity of the organization. So here I am. We're looking at it, and not surprisingly, because they've gone through this distressful period and they're coming out of it, very significant cash flow constraints. Right? We were constantly, as fast as we were pushing what we could out, that money was already allocated towards other obligations for the organization, and so it was very tight, and even to the point where we're sweating, payrolls weekly as we're paying them out. So as I'm coming into and I'm realizing what we're doing in that capacity, come to find out, so we had struck a deal with the local bank to do some factoring, which simply means that as we had sold an order and produced it, they were going to pay us in advance of the collection of that sale. And then for that, they were going to take a cut, but then we could at least get the money in quicker to then turn it back into operational capital to buy inventory, pay for labor.
Yeah.
And the terms of the agreement with the bank were very clear. Once we did the order, we sold the order, and it went through the production process. When it hit the dock, as it was ready to ship, that's when we could trigger the, the factor and submit for payment. And then it started the time for the collection. The customer would get it, and then typically we were operating within that 30-day term with our customer.
Okay.
What I had discovered was that the owner, president, was actually, because of his concern for cash flow and trying to keep this thing going, he started to trigger that. And the production, I guess it's important to note that the production could be 4 to 6 weeks, depending on what pieces, the glass, the frame, and all the stuff that came through it. Anyway, he started to trigger that process, in some cases 2, 3, 4 weeks before it got finished to the finish line. And so the bank, who thinks that, we're 30 days out on this order, the customer hadn't even gotten their product yet. So that became, and then he would come up with all kinds of reasons and would try to go to the customer to get them to give them even more of a discount if they paid cash right then, to try and get ahead of this before it got caught, right? So that part of it, a little sketchy, but it wasn't the worst. But what I discovered, and this is where I feel like I was being set up, was in the window manufacturing business, you have dealers out there who are selling windows, or at least quoting them, right? And our hit rate was about 25 to 30% of the quotes that we got actually turned into orders, which is not bad in the industry.
I was going to say, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. Yeah.
But what was happening was, when we got these quotes in, not the ones that actually turned into an order, confirmed order, but a quote, he was factoring those. Now, I have no idea how he thought we were going to make whole on an order that never was there. But that's when this transition was happening. When I discovered that, I was like, holy crud, I'm going to be the fall guy. This guy's going to this, albatross around my neck. And so I happen to have a brother who's a copyright patent attorney, and I call him up. I said, "This is what I just discovered." He's like, "Holy crud, you're in it. Here's what you need to do. You need to call the board, and let them know, because they're probably unaware that this is going on." And so I knew a few people on the board, and I reached out, and I'm thinking, gosh, we got to get this out in front of them so that we can, try to mitigate whatever the impact is.
Yeah.
Keep in mind that other investors, so not just I talked about the lending, I mean, there is millions of dollars of invested money into this company. So I expected them to be concerned, right? Holy crud, something's going on with our money. Let's call a meeting and do it.
Right.
I heard crickets. I was amazed. I could not get them to respond. And I go back to my brother. I said, "Why is no one, and so we had a corporate attorney, and I called the corporate attorney and said, "Listen, guy, here's what's going on." And she was starting to mix the representation of the corporate entity and interest with the owner's interest. And I'm having to say, "Listen, you got to understand, you can't do that legally. That's an ethical thing within your industry or within your profession. You can't do it. You're representing us, and I need you to step forward and do this." And she was a small town attorney, probably a great attorney, but clearly over her head. She wasn't banking for this kind of a cluster to get dropped on her lap. I didn't know how to handle. So I couldn't get her to do her job and represent and give us some advice. I couldn't get the board. And so at this point, and I really needed the job. I needed it. It was important to me and my family. And so anyway, at the end of the day, I did the only thing I could do. I had to resign. I couldn't put myself in that situation because the board had not formally instated me as the CEO or the president of the company. I wasn't bound and under the same fiduciary responsibilities that a corporate officer would have in that situation. Okay. And so I was able to resign. I sent the email to the board, but before I did, I wanted to meet with the staff because I really, or the workers, right, the employees, because I really felt that they were being poorly handled before, and I'd made some promises to them that things were going to be different. Well, we were going to treat them with a more responsible, ethical kind of way, and then to have to step out and basically say, "Tag, it's not my problem. I'm away from it. I'm not going to buy this bag of garbage." I felt bad. And so as I called this meeting, and oh, by the way, I guess another piece is that the owner, once he discovered what I discovered, and I let him know, I said, you got to stay away from the company. You can't come in here and mess with it, because anything you do is only going to confuse and mess with the situation. The board has to step up and do it. So anyway, he had been away for a few days. When I called this meeting, I get all the employees around, I stand out amongst them, and then here comes the owner. And I was like, oh, you gotta be kidding me. And so he wants to talk. I said, no, I'm gonna talk to these people. After we're done, then you and I can talk. I'm happy to do it. But right now, I'm having this conversation. So I told him what was going on. I told him that there's behavior and things that were going on. I didn't give him the specific. I just said, listen, there's some stuff for here that is going on for which I can no longer be a part of,
Right.
Not asking anybody to resign or quit in mass protest. You got to make your decisions on your own. But I just know that I cannot be in this position. And I feel like I failed you, and I apologize profusely. So, with that, then I looked to the owner. I said, okay, let's go to the office and we'll talk. And I literally fist clench. I thought we were going to go in there and this is going to be one heck of a bombastic, fisticuff, yelling match, whatever you can imagine, because his whole, castle that had been built and was relying on, I was threatening, right? I was going to tear it down. Here's the thing that blew my mind. So instead of going in there and having this, why did you do this, you dirty blankety blank, and all that kind of stuff, he apologized, tears in his eyes. I mean, it just was the most, I disarming thing I've ever experienced. I mean, we hugged, for heaven's sake. How can you, I got over my skis, I didn't know what I was doing, blah, blah, all this kind of stuff, and so, Fred, how do you act? I mean, so here he's supposedly contrite, right? And and so, as a compassionate person, you want to reach out, right? Anyway, so I still resigned. I said, I can't be part of this. I'm sorry, and left. And well, of course, then that wasn't his true nature, wasn't contrition. He was just doing that to try and get me to change where I was going with it for the benefit.
I was hoping that wouldn't be the case, but I wondered.
No, he wasn't. He was a kind of a snake. But the truth of the matter is it stunk. And so now I'm driving away. I have a peace. At least I didn't get sucked with this, this bad thing. But I didn't have a job. Needed a job. It wasn't like I was flush with cash and just rolling in it. So, a very difficult decision over the course of the few weeks where this thing kind of blew up in front of me. It was hard. I mean, I was trying to make it work. I was trying everything I could to find a way where we could resolve it and get out. At the end of the day, the problem was with the bank. The bank ultimately ended up finding out about and then calling the note, which then, made the whole thing come crashing down, and he ended up, having to liquidate and go to auction and everything went with it. But the bottom line is I didn't look to be in that position, didn't want to be in that position. But when I was found that I was in that position, I guess, unlike the banana story I told earlier, at least I chose to. Now, whether I chose to do the right thing because I didn't want to get saddled with the albatross that was be the legal hassle, had I been owning it, I don't know.
Yeah, regardless, though, I'm pretty sure you would have made the right decision on there, whether it's the legal ramifications or not. So, yeah, that's definitely, as I was listening to your story, I just kept thinking back to those scenarios that we give the undergrads about how you'd respond here. I'm like, yeah, there's not one that can encapsulate this story in any way to prep them for this sort of thing. So, yeah, this is definitely one of those that, unfortunately, you just have to learn trial by fire. But yeah, I'm glad it turned out for the best and that you were able to escape from that setting.
The only thing I can say, and I don't want to blow my horn too much, because there's a lot of study in personality temperaments and stuff that I really ascribe to, and one of them, and I tend to be in this camp, so full disclosure, there are those that do the right thing and stay the course, and then there's others that for whatever reason their option is kind of whatever works, right? And I tend to be in the whatever works as opposed to the, do the right thing kind of a thing. So I have no problem pushing rules and the boundaries in that respect. But the one thing that I guess I got to stress enough again, because you never know until you're thrown into these situations how you're going to act.
Absolutely.
But
true.
if in the middle of that challenge is when you decide where your ethical line is, it's too late, right?
Right.
If on the other side, or before you got into it, and you said, what was really important to me is I'm not going to sacrifice these things, my integrity and, other things for which they can come back on me. Now, when I get in a situation, there were a lot of sleepless nights. There was a lot of internal struggle with regard to how do I get out of this? Can I get out of this and resolve something on the benefit of my family? But, it's easier to make that decision, go down that pathway when you're not fighting the same demons of,
Right.
the ethic.
Absolutely true. Absolutely. Yeah, there's certainly no easy components normally when it comes to the ethical world, unfortunately. This has been good. Anything else you want to share?
No, I just, like I said, I think it's important. It's an important discussion. It comes across in everything. One of my roles you mentioned earlier, intellectual property officer for the
Yep.
university, uh, who's doing the work, who's disclosing it, who's contributing to it, what are you trying to get out of it? I mean, you'd like to believe that everybody's holding hands, singing kumbaya. One of the things we tell our clients that we work with in the
Right.
business community, the easiest time to have these conversations is when that is the case, right? Everybody's holding hands. This is going to be the greatest thing. It's going to be wheelbarrows full of cash to the bank. Okay, how do we handle if there's disagreement, if there's discord? How do we, conflict? If you have those conversations at least baked into some degree early on, then when you confront with them, and oh, by the way, you will confront them at some point, right? Where
Absolutely.
you thought, they thought something, then you're able to get through it a lot easier. If you avoid it with the hope that somehow it'll naturally take care of itself, you'll find that you'll oftentimes be stuck in a situation for which, as you pointed out earlier, the dilemmas, the outcomes are not necessarily either good. I mean, it's both equally bad. You just got to choose which one.
Very true. Very true. Well, Paul, thank you. Thank you again for joining us and talking today. Like I said, I think the students or colleagues, community members, whoever watches this, I think everybody will get a lot out of this. So thank you. I appreciate your time.
Oh, happy to be here, and thanks for the opportunity to share my stories.
Very welcome. Very welcome. Thank you.